She bought a WW2 bunker for cheap, then discovered what the government left behind. Elena Voss handed over $400 for a concrete structure that had been sealed for 70 years. The bunker looked like it should have cost nothing, buried under 30 feet of earth and choked with decades of tangled blackberry vines. But Vincent Ashford took that cash with trembling hands, signed the property transfer without meeting Elena's eyes, and drove away in his Lincoln Continental faster than a man should leave something he just sold. Elena stood there in the November wind, holding the deed, watching Ashford's taillights disappear down the narrow country road, and felt something cold settle in her chest. Why would a retired federal judge sell military property for less than a used appliance? The access hatch was barely visible beneath the thorny undergrowth, just a rusted steel door set into a concrete frame that emerged from the hillside like a grave marker. The hinges had oxidized into crusted orange formations, and the metal will lock looked like it hadn't turned since Kennedy was president. Most women would see a nightmare, a dangerous liability, potential collapse hazards and environmental contamination. Elena saw opportunity. Storage space she could convert for her struggling antique restoration business, maybe even rent out to preppers or survivalists who paid premium prices for authentic Cold War structures. Simple math. 400 in, maybe 3,000 in basic cleanup and safety measures, decent monthly income out. But when Elena descended the steel ladder with her Belgian Malinois cipher, the math stopped making sense. The dog froze on the fifth rung, ears flattened against her skull, refusing to go deeper. A low, guttural growl vibrated from her throat, the kind of sound Elena had only heard once before when they'd stumbled across a rattlesnake den during a mountain hike. Cipher had served 3 years as a military working dog before Elena adopted her. The dog had been through explosions, gunfire, high-stress raids. But here, 30 feet underground, the animal would not descend another inch. The air tasted wrong. Not musty like an old cellar or damp like a cave. Sterile. Antiseptic. Like a hospital that had been locked and abandoned mid-procedure. And cold, far colder than November soil had any right to be. Elena's LED flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a corridor that stretched impossibly far, well beyond what the property boundaries should allow. The concrete walls were marked with faded symbols, yellow and black radiation trefoils, biohazard warnings, and stenciled letters that read Containment Protocol Alpha and No unauthorized access beyond this threshold. Cipher pressed hard against the ladder, her entire body rigid with fear. Elena ran her bare hand along the concrete wall and felt something that made her pull back immediately. A vibration. Subtle but unmistakable. Like the bunker itself was alive with machinery that shouldn't be running, powered by electricity that had no reason to exist 70 years after abandonment. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees as she stood there. Her breath misted in front of her face. Underground spaces were supposed to maintain relatively constant temperatures, but this felt like standing inside a working freezer. She swept her flashlight beam along the ceiling and saw thick cables running the length of the corridor, disappearing into the darkness. The insulation looked newer than it should be, not vintage 1950s wiring but something that had been maintained or replaced. Recently. Elena climbed back up, her heart hammering against her ribs. Cipher scrambled away from the entrance the moment Elena's head cleared the hatch, putting 20 feet of distance between herself and the steel door. That night, Elena couldn't stop thinking about Ashford's shaking hands, about the deed signed without a single question or counteroffer, about the way the corridor had stretched into impossible distances, as if the $400 had not bought a storage space at all, but access to something that powerful people had spent decades trying to erase from public memory. She pulled out her laptop and started searching. Vincent Ashford wasn't just any retired judge. He'd spent 30 years on the federal bench, presiding over classified cases involving national security. His father, Gerald Ashford, had been a high-ranking official in the Atomic Energy Commission during the 1950s and 60s. And the property she'd just purchased, those 18 acres of overgrown woodland in Grafton County, had once been listed as Federal Reserve land, access restricted until 1989, when it was quietly transferred to private ownership. To the Ashford family. Why would the government give away military property? And why would the Ashfords hold on to it for 30 years before selling it to her for the price of a cheap television? For weeks before Elena Voss bought the bunker, she sat in her small workshop apartment in Portsmouth, staring at the eviction notice taped to her door. 60 days to vacate. The building had been sold to developers who wanted to convert the industrial space into luxury condos. She had 2 months to find a new workshop, new living space, and somehow keep her antique restoration business alive during the transition. The divorce had destroyed her financially. 3 years of legal battles over assets, business ownership, and debt distribution had left her with nothing but her tools, her dog, and a reputation for quality work that didn't pay enough to cover rising rents in the coastal city. She'd gone from a team of 4 employees and a thriving business to working alone out of a 600-square-foot space that smelled like wood stain and desperation. Her savings account held exactly $6,200. Not enough for first, last, and security deposit on any commercial space in the area. Not enough to relocate her business to a cheaper city. Barely enough to survive if she gave up the business entirely and started over doing something she hated. Most nights, she split her dinner with Cypher. That was non-negotiable. The dog had saved her life in more ways than one, providing purpose and companionship through the darkest months of the divorce. Whatever Elena had to sacrifice, Cypher's needs came first. She was at the hardware store buying sandpaper when she overheard 2 contractors talking near the paint aisle. Their conversation drifted through the store like a rope thrown to a drowning woman. You don't know if it'll save you or drag you under until you grab it. One mentioned that Vincent Ashford wanted to sell some old military property, trying to unload it before tax season. The other laughed, said nobody would touch Cold War bunkers unless Ashford paid them to deal with the environmental cleanup and structural liability. But Elena heard something different. Underground concrete space. Waterproof. Temperature controlled. Perfect for storing delicate antique pieces that needed protection from humidity and temperature fluctuations. Maybe even convertible to a workshop, or rentable to survivalist communities who paid premium prices for authentic bunker space. That evening, she tracked down Ashford at a private club in Dover, the kind of establishment where membership cost more than Elena's entire annual income. She had to talk her way past security, explaining she had a legitimate property inquiry. Ashford was older, maybe 75, with silver hair precisely trimmed and clothes that spoke of old money and careful maintenance. But his hands trembled slightly as he held his whiskey glass, and his eyes darted toward the exit every time the door opened. When Elena approached his table and mentioned the bunker property, Ashford went completely rigid. His glass stopped halfway to his lips, whiskey sloshing slightly. His face drained of color, then smoothed into something carefully, deliberately neutral. You want to purchase it? He asked, his voice tight. Depends on the price, Elena said. $400. Elena stared at him. Even contaminated land sold for tens of thousands. Property had intrinsic value simply for existing. She thought she'd misheard. $400. Cash. Today. Right now. Ashford already had documents in his leather briefcase, already sliding them across the polished table. I want it gone. Out of my family's possession. Off our name. That phrase, off our name, caught like a fishhook in her mind. It wasn't about money or liability. It was about legacy, about shame, about something that had haunted the Ashford family for generations. But Elena signed. She pulled out the cash she'd withdrawn that morning, money she'd earmarked for next month's rent, and handed it over. Ashford took it, stuffed the bills into his pocket without counting them, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out of the club without finishing his drink. Elena sat there alone with the deed, wondering what kind of property weighed so heavily on a federal judge's conscience that he'd sell it for less than a mortgage payment. Elena returned to the bunker the next morning with Cypher beside her and a full toolkit in her truck. The drive took 50 minutes through increasingly rural roads that twisted through pine forests until pavement gave way to gravel, then to rutted dirt tracks barely wide enough for her Ford Ranger. The property sat on 18 acres of dense woodland that Ashford apparently owned but had never developed, never visited, never acknowledged in any public records she could find. She'd barely slept the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ashford's trembling hands, heard that phrase about his family's name. A man didn't sell valuable property for pocket change unless something was catastrophically wrong with it, or unless something was buried there that absolutely could not be discovered. The question was which. And why he'd been willing to transfer that risk to her. In full daylight, the bunker entrance looked worse than she remembered. The concrete frame had hairline cracks spreading like spider webs, and rust stains streaked down from the steel door in patterns that looked disturbingly organic, like dried blood or chemical runoff. The wheel lock was seized completely solid. Elena had to use a breaker bar and penetrating oil, working for 30 minutes before the mechanism finally broke free with a metallic shriek that sent birds exploding from nearby trees. When the heavy steel door finally groaned open on protesting hinges, a rush of cold air emerged that carried odors Elena couldn't quite identify. Ozone, like after a lightning strike. Something chemical and sharp, like industrial solvent. And underneath it all, something that reminded her of the hospital where her mother had died, that particular smell of antiseptic trying to mask something worse. Cypher stopped dead at the entrance, every muscle in her body locked tight, hackles raised in a ridge along her spine. The dog stared into the darkness beyond the threshold and would not take a single step forward. Elena had worked with Cypher for 4 years, had seen the dog fearlessly pursue suspects and remain calm during explosions. But here, faced with an empty concrete corridor, the animal refused to proceed. Elena crouched down, running both hands through Cypher's thick fur, feeling the tension vibrating through the dog's entire frame. "Just an old government bunker," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Nothing about this felt old or abandoned or safe. She descended alone. The steel ladder was solid despite its apparent age, rungs icy cold even through her leather work gloves. 30 feet down, her boots hit concrete with a hollow thud that echoed far longer than it should have. She pulled out her high-powered LED flashlight and swept the beam across her surroundings. The corridor stretched in both directions, easily 80 feet visible before the darkness consumed the light completely. This wasn't a simple fallout shelter or storage bunker. The walls were marked with stenciled designations that made her skin crawl: Sector B4, authorized personnel only, biological containment zone, decontamination required beyond this point. Yellow and black radiation trefoils, biohazard symbols, warnings in multiple languages. But the Geiger counter she'd brought, a professional-grade detector she'd borrowed from a contractor friend, registered only normal background radiation. Nothing dangerous. Yet the warnings persisted, painted in stern military block letters that spoke of genuine threats or carefully maintained deception. She moved deeper, each footstep producing strange echoes that suggested the space was much larger than the property boundaries could possibly contain. 18 acres above ground couldn't hold what seemed to exist below. The acoustic properties were wrong. Sounds bounced and returned from distances that defied the physical layout. Doors lined both sides of the corridor, each marked with alphanumeric codes and security classifications. Most were locked with mechanisms that had rusted into permanent seals. Others had been welded shut from the inside, thick beads of metal fused across the door frames as if someone had been desperate to ensure they could never be opened again. But one door, approximately 50 feet from the entrance ladder, stood slightly ajar. The lock had been forced open. Recently. Fresh tool marks scarred the metal, bright scratches through decades of oxidation. Someone had been here before her. Someone who'd had the same idea she did, or who'd been looking for something specific. Elena pushed the door. It swung open silently on hinges that should have screamed with rust but moved as if they'd been oiled yesterday. Inside was an office frozen in time. A steel desk with a blotter still centered perfectly. Filing cabinets lined one wall, drawers slightly open as if someone had searched through them and left in a hurry. A corkboard still displayed yellowed papers, memos, and photographs that had faded to sepia ghosts. And on the desk, positioned precisely in the center, sat a locked metal case about the size of a large briefcase. Olive drab military paint, stenciled with white letters, classified Project Arctic Sun, authorized eyes-only, destruction required by 1975. The lock was broken. Recently broken, judging by the fresh scratches and the small pile of metal fragments beneath the case. The case was open, lid raised, revealing a single manila folder inside. Nothing else. Just one folder in a case designed to hold dozens of documents. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the folder. The tab read Grafton County Integration, Phase 3 Final Report. Inside were documents that made her stomach turn. Surveillance photographs of ordinary houses, schools, churches and what she recognized as the small towns within 20 miles of where she now stood. Lists of family names with neat checkmarks beside them, dates spanning from 1958 to 1987. Medical records with entire sections blacked out with heavy marker, but with enough visible to see patterns, unusual cancers, neurological disorders, birth defects at rates that should have triggered investigations. And a map. Hand-drawn in careful detail, showing the bunker complex extending not just under these 18 acres, but spreading like roots beneath neighboring properties, beneath the town of Millbrook 5 miles north, beneath places that had no reason to be connected to a military installation. Tunnels, dozens of them. Some marked sealed 1989, others marked active monitoring required. At the bottom of the folder was a memorandum dated November 1962, signed by someone whose name had been thoroughly redacted with black ink. But one paragraph remained perfectly, chillingly legible. Subject families have been successfully integrated into test populations across 6 communities. Atmospheric dispersion patterns remain within acceptable parameters. Monitoring will continue for 3 generations or until adverse health effects manifest in statistically significant numbers. In the event of discovery, all physical evidence is to be destroyed and Cover Story Protocol 7 is to be implemented immediately. Elena's vision blurred. She flipped through more pages. Names. So many names. Some she didn't recognize, families that must have moved away or died out. But others made her blood run cold. Vincent Ashford. Listed as second-generation observer, cleared for limited knowledge. Gerald Ashford, Vincent's father. Listed as project director, Site 7, full clearance. And near the bottom of a page listing potential exposure families, she found her own grandmother's maiden name. Catherine Brennan. Born 1945 in Millbrook. Died 1983 of brain cancer. The same grandmother who'd raised Elena's mother after her parents divorced, who'd lived her entire life within 5 miles of this bunker, who'd died of an illness the doctors called aggressive and unusual. Elena's hands went numb. The folder slipped from her grip, pages scattering across the desk. She grabbed them, shoving them back inside with shaking fingers, and stuffed the entire folder inside her jacket. Above her, Cypher barked. Sharp, urgent, the alarm bark that meant immediate danger. Elena ran for the ladder, her boots slipping on the concrete. She climbed faster than she descended, her lungs burning, the folder pressed against her ribs. When she emerged into daylight, a black Chevrolet Suburban was parked beside her truck. 2 people stood beside it, watching her with expressions that conveyed nothing. A woman in a dark pantsuit, maybe 40, with short blonde hair and eyes hidden behind sunglasses despite the overcast sky. A man in similar attire, older, with gray at his temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. Their presence said everything. Ms. Voss, the woman said, her voice flat and professional. We need to discuss what you found down there. And we need to discuss it now. The woman in the dark pantsuit didn't wait for Elena to respond. She gestured toward the Suburban with a motion that was somehow both polite and unmistakably a command. We can talk here, or we can talk somewhere more comfortable. Your choice. Elena's hand instinctively moved to the folder pressed against her ribs under her jacket. Cypher had positioned herself between Elena and the 2 agents, her body tense and ready. Who are you? My name is Director Sarah Mackenzie, the woman said, removing her sunglasses to reveal sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. "This is Agent Thomas Reeves. We're with a federal oversight committee that monitors historical installations." "Historical," Elena repeated, her voice flat. "Is that what you call human experimentation?" Something flickered across Mackenzie's face. Not surprise, but acknowledgement. She'd expected Elena to find something. The question was how much. "Mr. Ashford contacted us yesterday," Mackenzie said carefully. "He informed us that he'd transferred the property. That was not authorized. He seemed pretty eager to get rid of it," Elena said. "Why would that be?" Reeves spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly. "Vincent Ashford is 76 years old. His father died carrying secrets that ate him alive. Vincent didn't want to die the same way." He paused, studying Elena's face. "Some burdens get too heavy to carry alone. So he dumped it on me," Elena said bitterly. "He gave you a choice," Mackenzie corrected. "The same choice we're giving you now. Walk away. We'll buy the property back for $20,000. Cash. Today. You sign a non-disclosure agreement, you forget you were ever here, and you go back to your life. $20,000. More than Elena had in savings. Enough to find a new workshop, restart her business, maybe even hire help again. It was salvation wrapped in a legal document and a bank transfer. All she had to do was forget everything she'd seen. Forget the names on those lists. Forget her grandmother's name among the families who'd been used as test subjects without their knowledge or consent. "And if I don't walk away?" Elena asked. Mackenzie's expression hardened. "Then things become complicated. For everyone." Elena felt the folder against her ribs, felt the weight of all those names, all those families who'd never known they were part of an experiment. Who'd gotten sick and died thinking it was just bad luck or genetics or God's will. Who'd never received compensation or apology or even acknowledgement. "I need time to think," Elena said. "You have until tomorrow morning," Mackenzie said. "After that, we'll need to take alternative measures to protect national security interests." They climbed into the Suburban and drove away, leaving Elena standing alone with Cypher beside the open bunker entrance. The dog pressed against her leg, whining softly. Elena pulled out her phone. No signal out here, as expected. She'd have to drive back toward town to make calls. But calls to whom? Who could she trust with this information? Who would even believe her without proof? She looked down at Cypher. "What do we do, girl?" The dog's brown eyes stared back at her with complete trust. Whatever Elena decided, Cypher would follow. That was both comforting and terrifying. Her choice wouldn't just affect her own life. Elena spent that evening in a motel room in Millbrook, the folder spread across the cheap comforter, photographing every page with her phone. She uploaded the images to 3 separate cloud storage accounts under fake names, then emailed copies to herself using encrypted services. If something happened to the physical documents, the information would survive. Then she started making calls. First to a journalist friend in Boston who specialized in investigative reporting. Then to a lawyer who'd helped her during the divorce, someone she trusted. Finally, to her cousin David, a software engineer who understood digital security and could help her make sure the documents reached the right people if she couldn't do it herself. By midnight, she had a plan. Not a good plan, but the only one she could live with. The next morning, she drove back to the bunker. Mackenzie and Reeves were already there, leaning against their Suburban. Mackenzie held a briefcase that presumably contained $20,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. "Have you made your decision, Ms. Voss?" Mackenzie asked. "I have," Elena said. She pulled the folder from her jacket and held it up. "I'm keeping the property. And I'm keeping these documents. And tomorrow morning, copies of everything in this folder will be delivered to 3 major newspapers, 2 television networks, and a law firm that specializes in class action suits against the federal government." Mackenzie's face went pale. You're making a serious mistake. Maybe, Elena said. But it's my mistake to make. These families deserve to know the truth. They deserve compensation. They deserve justice. Justice, Reeves said, his voice bitter. You think exposing 70-year-old secrets is justice? Most of the people responsible are dead. The program was shut down decades ago. All you'll do is create panic and lawsuits that will tie up courts for years. Good, Elena said. Let it tie up the courts. Let people know what their government did to them. Let the families of the people who died get their day in court. Mackenzie took a step forward. We can't let you do this. You can't stop me, Elena said. The documents are already uploaded. Already distributed. If anything happens to me, if I disappear or have an accident, they go public immediately. My cousin has instructions to release everything if I don't check in every 12 hours. It was a bluff, partially. David had the documents, but whether he'd actually released them without hearing from her was uncertain. But Mackenzie didn't need to know that. For a long moment, the two women stared at each other. Then Mackenzie's shoulders sagged slightly. You're going to regret this, she said quietly. Not because of what we'll do, but because of what you're opening up. These secrets were buried for reasons. Bad reasons, Elena said. Maybe, Mackenzie acknowledged. But sometimes the truth causes more damage than the lie. They left. Elena stood alone beside the bunker entrance, holding the folder that had just made her a target, wondering if she'd made the right choice or a fatal mistake. 3 months later, Elena sat in a television studio in Boston, telling her story to a camera and millions of viewers. The documents from Project Arctic Sun had been authenticated by 3 independent experts. The Justice Department had opened an investigation. Families from 6 towns in Grafton County had filed a class action lawsuit. Vincent Ashford had given testimony confirming his father's involvement and expressing remorse for the family's silence. It wasn't justice, not complete justice. Most of the people responsible were dead. The program had been shut down in 1989 when internal oversight finally discovered what was happening. But it was acknowledgement. It was truth. It was a start. Elena's antique restoration business had collapsed under the media attention. She'd lost her workshop, lost most of her clients who didn't want to be associated with controversy. But she'd gained something more valuable. She'd given voice to families who'd suffered in silence for generations. She'd forced the government to acknowledge its crimes. She'd proven that one person with evidence and courage could make a difference. Cypher lay at her feet during the interview, calm and steady, the same way she'd been through everything. When the cameras stopped rolling and the host thanked her for her bravery, Elena felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. The bunker still sat on her property, sealed now by federal order while the investigation continued. She'd never make money from it. Never convert it to a workshop or rent it out. But that was okay. Some things weren't about profit. Some things were about doing what was right, even when it cost you everything. She drove back to her small apartment with Cypher beside her, thinking about her grandmother Catherine, who'd died never knowing why she'd gotten sick. Thinking about all the other families who'd finally have answers. It wasn't enough, but it was something. And sometimes, something was all you could do.